Welcome back to the Christmas edition. December. Is it the Christmas edition? It's coming in before Christmas.
Sure. Yeah, Christmas edition. Why not?
Yep. Q&A's December. What more is there to say? This is part 1. There'll definitely be a part 2, probably a part 3. And I have my lovely co-host Tim here, who's going to help me answer the questions. That's
cool.
You're going to do that, aren't you?
Yep.
But before he does, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new 12th gen CPU contact frame by DeBauer. It's well known that the integrated loading mechanism, or ILM, of the LJ1700 sockets bends 12th gen CPUs, leading to an uneven contact surface that reduces cooling performance. Solving this issue, the contact frame replaces the ILM, allowing for a much more even contact with the CPU's IHS and the base of your cooler, which in turn reduces operating temperatures. Installation's quick and easy, and thanks to the use of anodized aluminium, the contact frame is non-conductive. And then, for those of you who wish to further maximize contact, Thermal Grizzly now offers an optional lapping tool, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. Alright, what do you think of the current state of gaming on PC? Games releasing unfinished or with big stuttering issues caused by shader caching. I don't think PC gaming is going in the right direction, and the price of hardware at that. So, yeah, sort of low-end, mid-range gaming being dead, some people argue, which I guess I can see where they're coming from. And then game releases being, which is probably the more obvious issue, a lot of stuttery game releases, and whether it's, shader caching or whatever it has to be. But yeah, it's clearly...
It's not great, is it?
Yeah.
I think this year, 2022, has been probably one of the weakest years for game releases in some time. I think there's been sort of a lack of the major games. Like, obviously, there's been a Call of Duty and things like that, but games like Starfield, which was originally supposed to be released this year, have been delayed and all that sort of thing. I think it's been pretty weak. And then, there's been sort of these ongoing trends of issues. Like, I think over the years, we've seen game developers push the edge more and more in terms of how unfinished they can release games, like the things requiring major day one updates, or even months down the track, issues still aren't fixed, like Cyberpunk a couple of years back as an example. I think, a decade ago, games were released in a much better condition, but then you also kind of weighed that up with there weren't as many console releases coming to PC. There was often the issue of the poor PC port, so you would get games that are more finished, but then the PC version kind of sucks. Mm-hmm. So these days I think that's improved a little bit, but certainly things like shader compilation and those issues seems to be plaguing many games. We've just seen Callisto Protocol launch with terrible stuttering, which was somewhat addressed with future patches. We've seen Elden Ring is one of the big titles earlier this year, launched with stutter issues, which I believe is still the case today, even though that game launched like 9 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think maybe part of it's due to the fact that so many games are moving towards Unreal Engine these days. And it seems like just Unreal Engine 4 has had a lot of stuttering issues with shader compilation and stuff like that, and shader caching. And so, I think it's, that side of things. Hopefully, we can see developers push back when they do, delay games like we've sort of seen out of this year, that the lessons are learned that you probably shouldn't release games broken, because you're going to get negative reviews and negative feedback.
Yeah, it's not a new thing though, is it? It's been happening for a long time.
It's weird though, because you see like, Callisto Protocol got massively negative reviews at launch on Steam. I think what was that Marvel game that launched with like terrible PC performance that no one liked? Gotham Knights?
That's DC, isn't it?
DC?
Yeah, DC game. But that's right. That was
Gotham Knights.
It was the Gotham Knights game. Yeah. The performance in that's still pretty.
Yeah, so I think we've seen more delays, I think, lately. So hopefully that means some of the upcoming games that will be released sort of in the first half of next year will have a lot of these teething issues fixed. But it hasn't been ideal, to say the least.
Yeah, I don't know if it's gotten worse, because I remember there was years and years where there was like the worst possible PC ports. There were some shockers. Absolutely awful. I remember going back 10 years when on PC, basic things like VSync didn't work. You couldn't enable it, or in a lot of cases you couldn't disable it. I remember a lot of games where stuff like anti-aliasing didn't work. So I'm not convinced it's gotten worse. It's always been pretty
Yeah.
garbage.
I think it's more like, I think, yeah, the PC port issues have definitely improved. Like, we're not getting as many terrible PC ports. But I think what we're seeing on PC is kind of quality of games on consoles is very like, you used to see games on console that worked just fine. Like, you could play it on PlayStation, Xbox, whatever. They worked just fine. And then the PC version was kind of like the version no one played because no one played PC games. You had the terrible port. But these days, seeing the state that Cyberpunk launched in on console would never have happened a decade ago.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I think there's many other cases of that where these days, console games have multiple performance modes. We've seen games, ship without a 60 FPS mode on console, which I think these days is a significant oversight, to say the least.
Yeah, I was going to say.
So, yeah, I think that sort of state of gaming is sort of headed in not a great direction. But again, like I was sort of saying, many of the releases that were supposed to come out this year have been delayed, which maybe gives you some hope that they realize those games were not launching in a finished or good state. And it can even impact things like gameplay. Like, it may not even be a performance issue, but they may just have janky gameplay or issues that actually do affect the experience more than just technical stuff, which you really don't want to see in games. But yeah, and then of course the hardware side of things.
The hardware, again, is tricky because obviously there are expensive. There's two sort of sides to that one. GPUs are very expensive, but they can't just make very expensive GPUs because they want to make lots of money. Like, that doesn't really work like that. So clearly people are purchasing them.
Yeah.
So there is a market for that, and they're servicing that market, and then it'll filter down, as we've always seen. But at the same time, you can buy a really impressive gaming PC for not that much money. It's not the latest cutting edge thing, but compared to a console, like a 6800 XT is much more powerful. Ryzen 5 5600, that's a pretty good CPU, but there are other CPUs as well. So you can build a pretty good gaming system for, it'd be under $1,500 US or thereapouts. Which, is a lot more than a console, admittedly, but it's still a very powerful gaming system.
Yeah, and even just looking at, like, we just did the GPU pricing update for December, and while pricing has stagnated a little bit, even if you are buying in that sort of $200, $300, or even like $100 price range, there are definitely options for you today. And I think part of that discussion around the mid-range was kind of, obviously we haven't seen those, a new generation launch yet, which is standard, right? Like, almost always we see high-end cards come before the 60, GeForce 60 tier type product. But I think the previous generation, all of those mid-range cards launched in that period of terrible pricing, people complaining, lots of negative reviews. Like, I remember your RX 6600, 6600 XT reviews were fairly negative, and you look today and they're now great value products. And I think part of that sort of all goes into this discussion of, like, they launched in such a bad state, and a lot of people were sort of, another GPU I can't afford. It's going to, it's a $300 GPU, but it's twice the price because of mining or whatever. I think that sort of, has impacted a lot of the perception of the mid-range. Whereas today, if you do go and look at the current prices for these GPUs, they are very affordable. Like RX 6600 for, like almost $200 US. And even if you look on the used market in sort of that $150 range, which, AMD and NVIDIA aren't servicing you with good new GPUs at that price point anymore. But these days you can get like 5700 XTs for $160, $170 used. You can get the GTX 1660 series for under $150. And you have to buy a used GPU, but those cards are still very capable of playing today's games. Of course, not on ultra settings or particularly high resolutions, but they're playable. They're certainly not completely useless. So, I think we are going to see new mid-range GPUs at some point next year, and hopefully that will improve this discussion a little bit and sort of, I can understand people being a bit jaded with the high prices that we see at the top end. But if you are buying something today, I think there's still good options available.
All right, this is a monitor-related question, so naturally I will handle this one with my
makes sense.
Wealth of expertise. Can't keep a straight face and read the question. What would be the best way to clean a monitor screen to remove not only dust but particles of possible gunk, etc.? Probably finger marks and things like that, where people go, "Oi, what's that? What are you doing there?" I personally use what we are technically known as microfiber cloths, and this one is a glass cleaning cloth.
Yep, good
So
choice.
You can usually get them from like car detailing stuff. They're good because they're not too harsh. So they're definitely not going to, no matter how hard you push, they're not going to scuff up or scratch your monitor. But I wouldn't push excessively hard anyway because you don't need to. I usually just get this wet and then wring it out so it's damp but not dripping at all. So it's just a damp cloth, and that'll get grease and grime and stuff off. You just wipe it, and then having a second one that's actually dry is good to go over that and dry it all up. You definitely don't want it running or dripping on the screen. Just slightly.
No, you don't
damp.
want any droplets, really.
No, just slightly.
Those will dry streaky.
Yeah, you can use it dry.
Yeah, I found for doing like monitor B-roll, if I get a fingerprint on it accidentally or something, that even just a dry microfiber cloth will get it off pretty well, without having to worry about any liquids or something.
Yeah, that's a minor clean.
But yeah, if it's like, and it's good for cleaning dust as well. But if you're talking about like a year's worth of use where...
Like a couple of Fruit Loops on there.
Yeah, you won't get as much success as just the dry cloth.
Yeah.
But a dry cloth's a great way to make sure you don't get a streaky finish if you're using a liquid. So that's what I tend to go with first. But if that doesn't work, then obviously I'll try your trick. I mean, you can get like, cleaning liquids, but I've never found them to be like amazingly effective. Like if there was a great liquid that you could use, that would be amazing. But most of them are just fairly
pro tip:
standard.
microfiber cloth and water.
Yeah,
even
the cloth matters.
Even for cleaning your windows, whether it's the glass on your car, your home, or whatever. Forget the fancy liquids. Wash them. Have one cloth. Wipe it all off. The other cloth dry, and you'll get streaky-free, perfect windows. Believe me. Windex does not sponsor this Q&A series. They hate us. One tip of the Windex.
Well, we're never getting a Windex sponsorship now. You've ruined our chances.
All right, cut this out, editor. Don't include this. We want that Windex money.
Okay, so your 4090/4080 ray tracing benchmarks showed that the GPU isn't always a limiting factor, like in F122. You pointed out on the CPU as a cause of a bottleneck. If that's true, what exactly is the problem? For example, single/multi-core performance or memory cache. If ray tracing needs more cores to run and it being more feasible now thanks to more powerful GPUs, does it mean the famous discussion of 6 versus 8 cores, we love talking about cores, is back on? And are you planning to include some ray tracing benchmarks in CPU reviews?
Right. Okay, so I have been increasing the amount of ray tracing benchmarks in CPU reviews slowly as it makes sense to do so. So yes, we will see that, a progression of that as we go, but there's already a few games now where, F1 being one, where we usually have that enabled. 6 versus 8 core debate, no, I can't see that. The only way that debate becomes relevant is if there's no 6-core CPUs on the planet that can deliver, satisfactory levels of performance. Like there's no quad cores in existence right now where you could say, that plays all the games just fine with a reasonably high level, graphics card without stuttering or kind of issues. There's really no quad core that does that. If there's something like a 5800X 3D, there was a quad core version of that would be, wouldn't be a high-end CPU, but it would certainly be a good mid-range CPU, because the performance would still be very good, because it's about overall CPU performance. It's not about core count, because there's plenty of 8-core and 16-core and 24-core and 32-core CPUs that absolutely suck at gaming, and the 7600X, the Ryzen 5 7600X would murder all of them. So it's not about cores. Ray tracing doesn't make higher core count CPUs more relevant. It potentially makes CPUs with more overall CPU performance more relevant, more useful. And again, throwing more cores at the situation, especially when it comes to gaming, it's generally the least optimal solution because of the way games work. So it really comes down to having probably 8 fast cores. So the next generation of 3D V-cache CPUs will be really useful there.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason why the CPU is required for some aspects of ray tracing is that the GPU doesn't accelerate all parts of ray tracing. So when we talk about ray tracing cores and hardware accelerated ray tracing, what they really mean is that parts of the ray tracing, code, I guess, can be accelerated. And certainly some parts of that are still run, for example, on the traditional shader cores. It depends on the architecture of GPU you're talking about. Each architecture tends to add more hardware acceleration. That's kind of the trend that we've seen. More features get added. But even some parts of that still, are required to be run on the CPU as well. You can't hardware accelerate everything, at least at this point. So usually what we see when we enable ray tracing is VRAM usage increases, system memory usage increases, CPU usage increases, because it is taxing code and only parts of that can be hardware accelerated.
Yeah, and again, it's a hard one to answer just broadly, because how the CPU is utilized will likely depend on a per game basis. So whether it's using more cores with RT enabled, as in it's able to utilize more cores, or whether it's just leaning on the cores that's already using more heavily, hard to say. That will probably be game dependent. And as for what's going on F1 22, I speculated that it appears CPU limited, but without comparing more configurations, it's really a guess. That's what it appears to be on the surface, but the answer could be different. As you said, there's a lot of different factors there for what could be causing it. It was a bit like the NVIDIA driver overhead. The reason we were the first ones to really show that properly, exactly what was going on there, was to test an enormous amount of hardware configurations that really narrowed that down and showed exactly when and where it was happening and why. But if we had have just tested the configuration that was causing that problem, you'd just conclude that it's a CPU limitation. So without all those other configurations to work out what's going on, it's difficult. So you'd really have to dive into that, hone in on that specific test configuration, try a whole different heap of CPUs, GPUs, game settings with and without ray tracing, and work out what's going on there. So it require a lot of testing, but I guess a safe guess is, it does look CPU limited, and when we get a faster CPU to test there, when we update our GPU test system, hopefully in January, we'll see.
In their RDNA3 launch event, AMD was making a pretty big deal about how reasonably sized the new GPUs are, taking a shot at NVIDIA. Seems like the board partners didn't get the memo. Most AIB 7900 cards are bigger than a 4080 Founders Edition. But the AMD and NVIDIA FE cooling seems to be sufficient this generation. Are AIB coolers heading in the wrong direction, making consumers pay extra for something that's totally unnecessary?
I mean, yes and no. It depends on whether or not you want to overclock, and if you're overclocking the reference card, those fans are pretty loud, and they're pretty loud by default, not excessively. It's reasonable, but if you want like a silent operating high-end graphics card, then the bigger coolers definitely are of benefit. It's not for nothing. I think you'll also find like Asus, for example, with the Tough Gaming. I have that model, so I can comment on it. It looks to me, without having taken it apart, it's pretty well as close as you can get to a copy and paste from the GeForce cards, just rejigging it to suit the Radeon card. I think that looks to be the case. So it's probably cheaper for them to do that than redesign an entirely different looking fan shroud and everything for a dual slot card. But again, if you want to overclock and all that sort of stuff, I think they're fine. And
they fit in a lot of people's cases. Like, there's a lot of case space. Like, unless you're going like a compact build, then
I don't have a problem with them.
Yeah, if you're not using those slots, then you may as well fill it with cooling so that you can get a nice silent experience.
Yeah, the other factor would be, even for companies like PowerColor that don't have a GeForce part that they're then using to make the RDNA3 cooler, they've got to compete. Like PowerColor's top end model, Red Devil type thing, or the Sapphire Nitro Plus, they don't want some piddly little graphics card that has to compete with a 4080, because people are going to go, that's much better, more impressive looking product. I'll get that. So there's a bit of mind games going on there as well by providing something that looks very impressive. So I think that's a big part of it.
Do you think that the 7900 XT will be better down the road as AMD cuts prices? The card is unappealing at $900 US, but at $700 to $750, it probably would be a good deal. And thank you both for your excellent reviews. Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's basically what you said in your reviews. You said something pretty much on the money with this one.
Yep.
And as we've seen in sort of the week after you published your review, interest in the 7900 XT is not great. Certainly they haven't been flying off the shelves like the XTX model. Many countries have XTs in stock, even at the MSRP at the moment, at least as we looked at a couple of days ago. So maybe they've sold out at this point, but certainly from talking to retailers and stuff, it doesn't sound like people are particularly interested in it at $900, which makes sense because the card is worse value than the XTX.
Yeah, look, while my review, the thumbnail and title were quite negative, I mean, it's a bit of a joke at $900, let's be honest. the conclusion of the review was, the product works, the performance is quite good, but the price isn't. At $750, it would be quite a good value product. $700, it'd be a great value product that we could really highly recommend.
I think it would fly off the shelves at $700.
Yeah, it'd be a great value product. It'd be a great buy. But that's sort of what RDNA3 needed to be, right?
Yeah.
I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think AMD's sort of being stuck in this position of kind of, they're trying to get the biggest margins they possibly can, satisfy shareholders, which, again, they're a business, they're a company, they're publicly traded. That's their job, is to make as much money as they can. So you can sort of understand why they would be trying to go for, the NVIDIA tiers, trying to price match them. But I think the 7900 XT was kind of extra bad because, the XTX is kind of priced similarly to match other products, undercutting a little bit, but if you look at ray tracing, it's similar value. But then for some reason the XT doesn't even match up with the same, it's slower than the price drop. It kind of doesn't.
It's like 17% slower, 10% cheaper.
Yeah, so it's kind of, I would understand pricing it at exactly the price drop. Like they could probably do 15% cheaper for a 17% less performance, which still isn't amazing, but would have been like,
It's like you can have that for a bit cheaper. It's more in line with what you're expecting. So, bit of a weird choice there. I expect that product in classic AMD fashion, negative reviews, at least from us, and then they'll reduce prices and we'll be like, hey, 700 XT, the best value. I wouldn't be shocked if that happens 6 months from now or even less. So it's just, I don't know.
And it's bizarre because they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot by making all these negative reviews day one, which when the price does improve later down the track, most reviewers don't go back and revisit the cards and be like, let's do our second 7900 XT review. I'm not saying reviewers should do that. They certainly don't have to. It's perfectly fine not to do that. But, reviewers don't do that. So AMD is kind of in this position where, they make the product better later, but then they're stuck with people searching for that product. They're seeing those day one reviews saying, oh, this is a terrible product, and, just buy the XTX, or even buy an NVIDIA GPU or a competitor's GPU. It kind of hurts. That strategy I don't think is super great, especially if, they're kind of in that number 2 position, they're trying to increase market share. They kind of need all the wins they can get. And they kind of just...
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. But as you were saying, they're for profit and they know they're guaranteed X amount of sales. So they're like, we will milk the early adopters, the people who are going to buy the card anyway, almost no matter what we put the price at. So we'll jack the price up, we'll cash in on them, and then when sales slow down, we'll do an official price cut and people will get excited about it. So I think that's the strategy there, but it is disappointing to see, get really excited for these products and they sort of, arrive and, they don't live up to expectations and there's a few issues and, anyway. All right, Tim. Why is DLSS 3.0 a prominent feature on top-tier flagship NVIDIA cards? Why? I thought it was a way for lower performing cards to artificially add FPS. If you're paying thousands for a 4090, why is DLSS 3 a selling point? Well, I think that's kind of our point, right?
Sort of. I mean, obviously NVIDIA is promoting it with their 4090 and 4080 because those are the only cards that support the tech. So it's not like they're choosing to promote it on high-end and not mid-range cards. It's just that there's no mid-range cards, so they're kind of forced into promoting it with the 4090. But I mean, that's kind of part of what we said.
Our point's more, sorry to jump in on you, but it's kind of not a super useful technology for the most part with a high-end card like a 4090 because, correct me if I'm wrong, we sort of found a window where if you're sort of 60 FPS and below, it's not super useful for most titles because it doesn't improve input latency, so it leads to sort of this weird effect. And then at 100 FPS, it's actually kind of cool because you have decent input there and it really smooths out frame rates. And then once you go beyond 100 FPS, certainly well beyond 100 FPS, it's like it doesn't really do anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with the 4090, and it's hard to call this an issue, is that the 4090 runs a lot of games really fast.
It's a high-class problem.
So, you're playing a game at 180 FPS, you don't really need DLSS 3. I think Though that said, there are many scenarios where DLSS 3 will still benefit a 4090. I think Flight Simulator was one of those. For example, it is a CPU limited game. You've got this 4090, and even if you're running it on a 13900K, you're still probably only going to be running at fairly low frame rates. It's not a high-paced game, so again, input latency isn't too much of a concern. So DLSS 3 on a 4090 does make sense in a game that is very CPU limited, like Flight Simulator.
A simulator. That's, I'm just saying, not a game. People get very sensitive when you call it a game.
I mean, okay, but there's whether or not you need DLSS 3 in a game like, I don't know, City Skylines or something is questionable,
No,
but
definitely not.
Those sort of CPU limited, non-latency important games, on a 4090, you're going to see some benefits there. But yeah, it is kind of a weird one because when we start getting like 40, 50 tier cards, I think we are going to see people relying on DLSS 3 to some degree to get playable frame rates. And I have question marks over how good that experience really will be if the baseline frame rate on those GPUs without DLSS 3 is only 30, 40 FPS. Like if you're trying to hit 60 FPS with DLSS 3, the game is not going to feel very good.
Yeah, because I don't beat around the bush. I'm just coming out right now and saying it's going to be next to useless.
Yeah, I mean, if that's the performance tier of those cards, it's not going to be good.
Yeah, it's going to be next to useless. I'm calling it out. People will get very upset with that. They'll argue with me. I'm not really here to argue about it. I'm just telling you that's my opinion. I've said I know the limitations of the technology. I've used it. I know where it's useful and where it's not useful. And I also know it's not. You wouldn't use it for multiplayer gaming anyway. Period. Really.
No, I mean it increases latency relative to running it with NVIDIA Reflex. So you just enable Reflex.
So it's really a single player.
Yeah, I mean I've sort of explained it as
or a multiplayer like Flight Simulator type thing.
Yeah, I see it as sort of, if you're buying a mid-range card, so not the 4050, which will run things too slow, and not a super high-end card that doesn't really need the tech, but mid-range, so 4060 Ti maybe, 4070, depends on the performance of those cards. If you're getting, it depends on the game and how latency sensitive you are, but if you're getting, let's say 100 FPS, you're getting maybe 80 FPS in some, not particularly high.
So let's say
games,
Cyberpunk, for example.
like a Cyberpunk. If you're getting 80 FPS, you turn DLSS 3 in Cyberpunk, it runs really well. Like it does genuinely, the artifacts aren't super noticeable. That game didn't have heaps of artifacts, as many as some of the other games. If you've got a high refresh rate monitor, it looks smoother, you get better motion clarity. It does improve the experience, but again, it's limited to that sort of the mid-range card. You're in a certain performance window, and you've got your high refresh rate display. So
just really high fidelity single player games where you're natively around the 80 to 100 FPS. That's where it's going to be of benefit.
I think I said 100 to 120 FPS, but again, it depends on...
120 FPS is pretty good though.
Yeah. It depends on how latency sensitive you are. Personally, I was playing, starting out with 60 FPS in Cyberpunk, I found to be a little too slow. You can do apples to apples comparisons where you turn it on or off and you can sort of see what it feels like. And that was me personally. I felt that's the baseline of 60 FPS. Getting up to around 100 to 120 FPS was a bit slow in terms of input. But then as soon as you start getting to, like 80, 100 FPS baseline and DLSS 3 spitting out 180 FPS or that sort of level of performance, feels really smooth.
This is a tough one. It's going to be, it depends because there's so many people that get really very, very, very upset when we say stuff like 30 FPS is not playable.
That's true.
Like they get very up. So if you're the kind of person that's like, no, 30 FPS is very playable, the input at 30 FPS is fine, then I think DLSS 3 is going to be awesome.
That's true. And the same for 60 FPS.
So which is what you're saying about how latency sensitive you are.
Yeah, that's true. But I think as well, part of my, not really an issue, it's more just a concern in general, is that if you're buying a new GPU and you're expecting the experience of 120 FPS, but what you're actually playing is 60 FPS with DLSS 3 pushing you to 120 FPS, it's not the same as real 120 FPS gaming. So it's kind of like, if you are latency sensitive and you want the full benefit of 120 FPS by increasing the smoothness, decreasing latency, DLSS 3 doesn't give you all of that. But then again, a lot of the time, games are very playable at 60 FPS with, the input latency is perfectly fine. And for those gamers, DLSS 3 with the baseline of 60 is going to be fine. But for me personally,
Yeah.
I do think there's a benefit to single player gaming at 120 FPS versus 60 FPS. The input latency is better, it's smoother, and DLSS 3 only gives you sort of half the benefit. So again, it's such a complicated discussion,
Yeah,
and that's why my video on it was so long, is because you have to kind of cover off all these points.
It's a personal thing. Like, for me personally, 60 FPS input, even in a single player game, is horrible. I would prioritize the input latency over the visuals. So in Cyberpunk, I would rather a native at least 90 FPS. That's my bare minimum. The input below that it's a jarring, horrible experience to me. I don't like it all. And I know there's a lot of you guys in the comments who have said exactly the same thing. It's around 90 FPS where the input becomes bearable.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the discussion with DLSS 3, isn't it? It's kind of like you have to decide what do you tolerate to begin with. Like, maybe it's 90 FPS. We've seen comments of people saying 30, as you said.
Yeah, we have 30
which is fine. So
or 40.
That's a discussion. You'll need a GPU that can do that minimum level for you, and then it kind of provides this nice bonus for you.
It does, yeah.
It's a good bonus. It's not like it's making things worse at that level. It certainly does improve it. But again, you need to just figure out what's that baseline for you and then expect a bonus. Which
so
I think,
if it's 30, you've got a big window of its usefulness.
Yeah.
If it's me where it's 90, but then once you get to 120, it's like, you've got that tight window of about 30 FPS where it could be a useful thing.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be, it's not like, again, if you're running at 120 FPS to begin with and you use DLSS 3 that's not doing anything or making it worse.
Yeah, but I'd be playing multiplayer, so you wouldn't
that's
use
right.
So.
I think some of the bigger concerns with it is more like, trying to make it work with frame limiters and VSync, because a lot of people don't have significantly high refresh rate displays. Like 240 hertz isn't common, so to get the full benefits without tearing and stuff, they're going to need to work on those sorts of features. Again, I haven't really done too much DLSS 3 investigation since the initial video, so I'm not sure whether they've improved those sorts of things since then. But yeah, I think it's interesting to see the sort of feedback from that. I didn't want it to come across in the video like DLSS 3 is a terrible feature that's not worth using in any circumstance. It's more niche in terms of its usefulness than DLSS 2. So again, when it comes back to this question, it's like the nicheness in terms of the GPUs where it's going to matter, in my opinion, is going to be the mid-range products, with the low end and the high end being less relevant. But again, we'll have to wait and see where the performance lies for those cards and, that sort of thing.
Alrighty, going to hit pause there on the part 1 of our Q&A session for December. Good stuff. And there'll be more to come with part 2 and part 3. And my voice will not improve for those ones, so you'll just have to bear with me. But anyway, thanks to everyone who asked questions, upvoted questions, did all of that sort of stuff, and hopefully you guys enjoyed our answers.
Yep. Also, if you want to support the channel, we do have our Patreon and Floatplane accounts. Links to those are in the description. You'll gain access to things like our monthly live stream, which I guess you'll have to wait until January for the next monthly live stream by the time this comes out, but those are always a bit of fun. We've got our Discord community if you want to come and join the chat. I'm sure there'll be plenty of stuff happening over CES as well to chat about in there. BTS videos, all sorts of good stuff. So, yeah, that's pretty much the end of this one. I'm your host, Tim.
I'm your host, Steve.
We'll see you in the next one.